Picture this. It's early 2026. The world seems to be spinning out of control. We see a regime toppled in South America, a major cartel boss taken down in Mexico, and then a shocking airstrike in the Middle East. Now, on the surface, these all look like chaotic, completely separate events. But what if I told you they weren't random at all? What if they were all perfectly timed pieces of a single, massive global strategy, all aimed at one single target?
Okay, so let's get right into it. And we have to start with the one event that just made no sense to anyone. On February 28, 2026, American warplanes are bombing Tehran. The official line? They had to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. But here's where it gets really weird. Just 48 hours before that, literally 2 days, Iran had signaled a huge breakthrough in Geneva. They were basically saying they were ready to give up their enriched uranium. I mean, a peace deal was right there on the table.
It makes zero sense. Why would you launch a massive military attack on a country that's just handed you the biggest olive branch in years? The official story, well, it just doesn't add up. It's pretty obvious that something else, something much, much bigger, was the real goal here. Now, this is where things get really interesting. To solve this puzzle, you have to zoom out, way out, because that strike on Iran, it wasn't some isolated incident. Nope. It was actually the final explosive move in a quiet global operation that had been playing out for months. Think about this timeline. In less than 2 months, the U.S. carried out major operations in 3 totally different countries on 3 different continents. First, they helped flip the regime in Venezuela, then they took out a top cartel leader in Mexico, and finally, the bombing in Iran. I mean, they look completely disconnected, right? So, what's the hidden link? What ties all of this together? Well, when analysts started putting the pieces together, a pattern emerged that was just stunningly clear. Venezuela, Mexico, and Iran, they all had one massive thing in common. They were all absolutely critical strategic partners for China. Each country was basically a lifeline propping up China's ambitions to expand across the globe. All right, let's look at the first piece of this puzzle, Venezuela. On January 3rd, U.S. Delta Force hits Caracas and arrests President Nicolas Maduro. Now, the official story was about his dictatorship and election fraud, but the real target? It was China's financial vault in South America. The goal was to slam it shut. You see, over the last 2 decades, China had sunk over $62 billion into Venezuela. They caught them in something called debt trap diplomacy. Where you lend a country so much money they can never pay it back, and then you basically own them. In exchange for the cash, Maduro turned his country into a Chinese puppet. But with Maduro gone, the new pro-US government is saying, hey, those loans aren't legit, and they're refusing to pay back the last $12 billion. And boom, just like that, the impact is huge. For China, a 20-year, $62 billion investment completely wiped out, overnight. Their main foothold in resource-rich South America, gone. The first lifeline was cut. Now, let's jump to the second lifeline. Just 7 weeks later, on February 22nd, an operation backed by U.S. intelligence takes out Mexico's most powerful cartel boss, a guy known as El Mencho. But this was never just about the war on drugs. No, this was about slamming shut a back door that China had been using to sneak into the American economy and its society. China was playing a 3-pronged game in Mexico, and it was devastating. First, Chinese companies were shipping the raw chemicals for fentanyl, the drug that's killing over 70,000 Americans a year. Second, Chinese criminal groups were laundering billions of dollars in drug money for those same cartels. And third, Chinese companies were using Mexican factories to slap a Made in Mexico label on their goods, just so they could illegally get around U.S. tariffs. So, taking out the head of the cartel just threw that whole criminal supply chain into chaos. At the same time, with a lot of pressure from the U.S., Mexico slapped a new 35% tariff on Chinese goods. That loophole? Closed. The second lifeline, China's dirty back door into North America, was officially severed. And that brings us right back to that baffling attack on Iran. You gotta understand, for China, Iran was way more than just an ally. The Middle East is full of U.S. partners like Saudi Arabia. Iran was China's only real friend in the neighborhood, its only foothold for its giant Belt and Road project, and, most importantly, it was its private gas station. Because Iran was under all those sanctions, it sold its oil to China for super cheap.
We're talking a discount that saved Beijing over $5 billion a year. That is a critical energy lifeline. And in return, what did China do? It armed Iran to the teeth with advanced air defense missiles and radar systems that could supposedly detect stealth aircraft. So that bombing on February 28th was never about nuclear talks. It was a decapitation strike. It was perfectly timed with Israeli intelligence to hit when Iran's entire senior leadership was all in one room for a meeting. The strike didn't just take them out, it literally collapsed their entire command structure in a single day. And it proved that those fancy defense systems China had sold them, utterly useless. China's last pillar in the Middle East just crumbled. So here's the key takeaway. When you stop looking at these as just random news stories and you start seeing them as moves on a global chessboard, well, the real picture comes into focus. And frankly, it's terrifying. These weren't three separate operations. It was one single coordinated attack. This is what geopolitical analysts are now calling the anti-China triple encirclement. It was a quiet, undeclared campaign to systematically and simultaneously cut China's three most important lifelines for global power: its foreign capital, its shady trade routes, and its independent supply of energy. This slide just lays out the whole playbook, and it's brutally simple. Hitting Venezuela cut off the flow of money and influence from South America. Taking down the cartel in Mexico shut down that backdoor for illegal trade into North America. And the strike on Iran, that eliminated the independent energy supply and their anchor in the Middle East. Three pillars of China's global strategy just torn down in less than 2 months. And you know, all this pressure from the outside could not have come at a worse time for Beijing. Because while the US was tightening the noose around China, the country was already starting to rot from the inside. We're talking about a catastrophic real estate market collapse, an economy that's slowed to a crawl, foreign money leaving the country as fast as it can, and growing unrest at home. So China is getting squeezed from every possible direction, all at once. So the real lesson here is that you have to look past the day-to-day headlines. The real story isn't always what's being reported on the news. It's about connecting the dots between those reports. It's about seeing the hidden strategy that's playing out behind all the noise. The triple encirclement was an absolute masterclass in grand strategy, and it's left China backed into a corner with its global dreams in shambles. The chessboard is set for a brand new and probably much more dangerous phase of this rivalry. The only question now is, what's China's next move?